Good evening, IPDETers. Good evening. I welcome you this 8th day of IPDET 2011. And to what is, I think, our last dinner speaker of this series, because tomorrow night we party, right? And Friday is your presentations that we're all looking forward to. So I am very pleased and honored tonight to welcome our speaker, Dr. Munir Sheikh. He has been the head of Statistics Canada. He has been the chief statistician. And as such, this has been no small job. It's interesting that tomorrow is our last module of IPDET. And the last module is on ethics and a bit on the political nature of evaluation, because we are naive if we think that politics does not enter evaluation. So it's very fitting that tonight we have Dr. Sheikh speaking on, in a way, the politics of the long-term census form and the issues that arose here in Canada. So I think we will find this very informing, and it will be something that we can even pick up on tomorrow in class. I have learned that Dr. Sheikh is now a member of Carleton University's faculty. He is on the faculty of the School of Public Administration, and he is doing courses on public policy. But that's only sort of his part-time assignment. He has been appointed co-commissioner of Ontario's Social Assistance Review. What this means is that he is basically heading an effort to review the welfare program. And you talk about politically sensitive, that's politically sensitive. And he has probably earned his stripes on the census form and now is entering what will probably be another contentious issue. We are delighted to welcome him. He's a distinguished fellow, adjunct professor at Queen's University in Kingston, and again, a distinguished visiting scholar at Carleton here. You can read his bio, which copies are on the table in front of you. Let me, at this time, ask you to join me in giving him a very warm IPDET welcome.
Thank you, Linda, for your very kind introduction. And let me also thank the International Program for Development Evaluation Training for inviting me to come here, and thank you, Ray and Deborah, who is here somewhere, for giving me the honor to come and speak here to you today. Let me also take this opportunity to thank the World Bank for having established this program on evaluation training at Carleton and in the city of Ottawa, which I hope you visiting Ottawa to take this training would find it really is quite a beautiful city to live in, and that's one reason that I've been here in the city for 40+ years. Let me also say that you coming to Carleton, which is a wonderful school, and attending this program on evaluation training, have done the right thing, and I thank you for having selected this university and this city to come and take your training. Let me begin with a fairly simple but really important proposition that I deeply believe in. And the proposition is that decision making whether it is at an individual level or at the government level, which means developing public policy, should be based on evidence and not on beliefs and ideology. If we do that, my view is that we'll all be better off. It doesn't happen all the time, but I think as professionals, it is our responsibility to keep pushing those who make public policy in that direction. I have spent many, many years working in the Government of Canada and in some other places. But one thing I have never forgotten is the two stories that my very first boss, after I started to work, told us at a meeting of his staff. Those are stories that have stayed with me because they have deep implications for the kind of work I do, and I won't mind sharing those stories with you. The first story he told us was that in this biology class, in the good old days, I'm talking here 30 plus years, in this biology class, the professor would give every student a small animal to do research on. And in this particular assignment, he gave everybody a frog and basically said, you go and dissect the frog, and make notes on the evidence that you collect based on your experiment. And then we'll figure out, who has understood what. The one thing about this frog was that this frog could understand English, so that, is the basis for this story. So this one student decided to cut one of the four legs of the frog and said, jump. And the frog, fully fluent in English, jumped, and the student recorded that evidence. Then the student cut the second leg of the frog and said, jump, and the frog jumped again, and so he duly recorded that evidence a second time. He then cut the third leg of the frog and said, jump, and the frog jumped again. Then he cuts the fourth leg of the frog and says, jump, and of course the frog could not jump. So the student then recorded the evidence, and the evidence was that when you cut the fourth leg of the frog becomes deaf. So, and that really, little story really came to me handy when I was appointed Chief Statistician of Canada, and I want to make sure that we don't collect the kind of evidence that the student was collecting. The second story that he told us, which again was very useful for me, as my job as Chief Statistician, was that there were these people flying in a plane, and the plane had 4 engines, and the pilot comes on and said, I have bad news for you guys, but it's really not that bad. One of the 4 engines has stopped, and we can even fly on one engine, so nothing to worry about. The only issue here is that it's going to take us an extra 2 hours to get to our destination. And then the second engine blows up, and the pilot again shares that information with the passengers and says, now it's going to take us an extra 3 hours to get to our place. And then, of course, the third engine goes, and now it's going to take us 4 hours to get to our place. And there's this one passenger who's getting really fed up. He said, does that mean if the fourth engine blows up, we'll be in the sky all night? And so, that has implications for how do you do data imputations. You don't always have the information. So what is the best way to finding information when some does not exist? I'm going to talk about, as Linda said, the long-form census. Now, I assume that you folks doing evaluations would be experts in using data. So I start with that assumption that you know a lot about the data. And the census, of course, is where everyone who is asked to provide information must do so, and so census and the word mandatory go together. Around this time last year, the government of Canada made the decision that one part of the census, which is what we call the long form, would not be a census anymore, and it will be replaced by a survey which will ask the same questions, but the survey is going to be voluntary. Now let me give you a bit of history of our census so you begin to appreciate the significance of that decision. The first census in Canada, what we call Canada today, was conducted in 1644 by this gentleman who came from France and whose name was Jean Talon. So he ran a census, he counted everybody in this vast land and found that there were 3,212 people living in this place, the settlers, not the original Canadian population, the First Nations, the Aboriginal people. And so the process of running a census continued from 1644, and in 1921, the census that was done in Canada had 565 questions. And you can imagine in that day and age, in a vast country like Canada, to run a census with that many questions must really be a big deal. In 1971, the statistician at Statistics Canada came to a decision, which was we're going to have the census done in two parts. Asking all these questions of everybody is a big hassle. So we're going to do the census in two parts. There's going to be a short form and a long form. The short form will only have 8 questions, and the long form will have 53 questions for a total of 61 questions. The only difference between the two forms was that from a statistical point of view, just to make sure that your data have the quality that you need and you want, that the short form will be filled by every person who gets the form. That is every Canadian head of the household. The long form, on the other hand, which has the other questions, will only go to 1 in 5 households. And the reason simply was that statisticians felt that for those questions, if we can get a mandatory response from everyone who gets that form, that sample of 1 in 5, selected randomly, would provide information which will be as accurate as the information in the short form, but the nature of the questions obviously is different. So in 71, the long form got invented. Sorry, the short form got invented. The long form, or the form with the most questions, as you now know, continued from historical times. Since 71, these two census forms have been sent and they have been completed. And of course, the last time this was done was in 2006. In 2010, as I said, last year, about a year ago, the government decided enough is enough, for reducing the burden on Canadians and giving them a choice to protect their private information from being given to the government. We will make it voluntary for Canadians to fill that form. Now that long form contains information which is really important for individuals, for governments, for academics, for the media, for research organizations, because it has questions on your income, your labor force status, questions on housing, transportation, questions on immigrants, on ethnic minorities. These are all questions which are really quite important in developing social and economic policy, particularly being the only source of information for some of the groups, such as Aboriginal people, where we don't collect data on a regular basis because these groups don't want us to do that. So, but the census provides us the only source of information, and so we won't have that information anymore as part of a census. So when the government made the decision, every section of society in this country complained about it. There were 370 organizations which told the government that it had made a bad decision and that the government should reverse it. Looking at that list, you could see that it had organizations from the right side of the spectrum, from the left, from the middle, anybody you could think of, they were part of that group. The government did not reverse the decision. The census has actually taken place. May 10th was the date for the census. And the survey, I assume, has been done as well. We'll see in about a year's time what the quality of these data are, because we don't know yet as to what information Statistics Canada has received. Wait and see, and we'll find out. At the time that this issue arose, there were three very different kinds of challenges that happened. I'll go through each one of those briefly, and if you have any questions after that, I'll be very pleased to answer those questions. The three issues were, first, what will be the effect of the cancellation of the long-form census and the replacement of that census with a survey? First big issue. The second issue was what happens to the independence of Statistics Canada as a statistical agency. And the third issue was my resignation. Now they got discussed in the Canadian media and by the public in the reverse order of their importance. My view was that my resignation is the least important of the three issues, but it, of course, got quite a lot of coverage in the media, and it really became a big issue. Only in Canada, and trust me, can the census become a big issue. We actually are really fortunate that in this country, census is a big issue. In other countries, there are other things people worry about. We worry about the census. So my resignation, as I said, became a big issue, and of the three that I mentioned, at least in my view, I think it was the smallest. The second issue, which got considerable attention, was the quality of data that StatCan was going to produce as a result of this decision. And the one issue which did not really get much attention was the independence of Statistics Canada as an organization. In my view, that really is the biggest issue of all. So let me actually go through these three issues. I'll begin with a bit of a discussion of what is the impact of the decision on the quality of data in general. Then I'll touch upon the issue of the independence of Statistics Canada as an organization. And then I'll conclude with some comments on my resignation, which you may want to listen to. As Linda said, it may link into what you're going to be discussing tomorrow. So the first issue, the quality of data coming out of Statistics Canada. I don't know how many of you are aware, but Statistics Canada, for many, many years, has been considered to be the best statistical agency in the world. I think it is the best statistical agency in the world, but given what has happened over the past year, my worry is it may not remain there for a long time to come. That's why it is a fairly serious issue, and that's why the next issue I'm going to talk about, the independence of Statistics Canada, becomes even more important. Now, as a statistician, I have argued since leaving my job, and I've argued that in public, that the quality of data coming out of a survey is nowhere close to the quality of information that you collect through a census. It's a fairly simple argument to make. Imagine, for the sake of argument, that all people sitting in this room is the complete population of a country. If I asked you a question that every one of you had to answer, the information that I'm going to get out of that would be fully representative of what you people think. That's the census. If I randomly, select 10% of you folks, or if you decide not to answer the questions that I'm asking you because it's a voluntary survey, then the information I collect by definition is not totally representative of what you may think. How good or bad it is, it really depends on the response rate. It really depends on who self-selects to answer those questions. If, say, my question to you was, tell me what your income level is, and if it turns out that those with a lower level of income said, I'm not going to answer this question, and only people with high income levels answered the question, and I took an average of those numbers, that will be completely inappropriate, as a representative of the income of this group. So I have been making the argument that the quality of data coming out of this survey will not be as good as that of a census, and the data that gets used, the census data that gets used for the kinds of things that it gets used for, it requires a much higher quality than this voluntary survey would produce. So the first consequence is that the quality of this information that is collected in the survey will deteriorate. But that's not where the story ends. The next issue is that a census gets used as a benchmark for fixing problems with other voluntary surveys that the agency undertakes. So for example, if I am running a voluntary survey and I'm getting these responses which are biased, then I need to correct that bias. And how do I correct the bias? I use the census as an anchor to do that. And if I don't have the census, I can't correct the bias in a voluntary survey. So the effect of not having a census goes beyond not having a census. The third thing which worries statisticians is that when you have these two things, a short form and a long form, and you start saying one is mandatory, the other is voluntary, I'm not sure that everybody in the country understands the difference between those two and remembers that one is mandatory, the other is voluntary. And in fact, I was quite taken aback by the responses of some professors and students when I was asked to give a talk, and a professor actually asked me the question, said, is the short form mandatory or not? Of course it's mandatory, but for a professor to not know that the short form is mandatory makes the point I'm making, which is this debate of the difference between the two forms is confusing to a lot of people. And because of that, the quality of the short form census itself is put in doubt. And if that happens, that will be really scary, because this short form information gets used for a lot of really important things, such as how many parliamentary seats are going to be there, how are they divided among provinces. The federal government transfers $60 billion every year to provinces and territories in Canada, and the basis for that transfer, short form census. So when you're not quite sure about the quality of this data, you can imagine there'll be problems coming later down the future where a province may say, I don't trust this information, and so I don't agree with your number on how many seats we're going to get in Parliament. Really important stuff. The next issue, again on the quality front, that arises is if the view of the government is Canadians should not be forced to provide statistical information. Where do you stop? Why just stop with a long form census? What about the labor force survey, which asks people, are you employed or unemployed? That is mandatory. When you ask a business to provide information to you, every single business survey in this country is mandatory. The agricultural census is mandatory. So where do you stop? And if this is the mindset that Canadians should have a choice of providing their information to governments or not, you know, anybody, a household being asked a question on the labor force survey, a business being asked a question, you say, I have heard the government say that you don't have to provide that information. So, you know, for the sake of consistency, I won't give it to you. That has serious consequences for the quality of all of your data. So, you know, that is really quite worrisome. My hope is that, you know, things will get better. But to ensure that things do get better, let me now move on to my second point, which is the independence of Statistics Canada. One reason that Statistics Canada has been considered to be the best statistical agency is because StatCan has been known to be independent and neutral. Now, this independence of Statistics Canada, as nobody, you know, seemed to care, is not grounded in our law. The Statistics Act, it does not provide the independence that Statistics Canada has enjoyed for many, many years. When you look at the Act itself, surprisingly, it gives the authority for making decisions, even of a methodological nature, to the minister responsible for Statistics Canada, not to the chief statistician. However, in the past, you know, for the whole existence of Statistics Canada, governments have not interfered in the work that StatCan does, except last year. So the question has arisen as to whether or not it will be desirable to have the independence of Statistics Canada enshrined in law itself. Last year, after this incident, 4 prominent Canadians, one a retired governor of the Bank of Canada, 2 heads of the public service and the clerks of the Privy Council, and the former chief statistician before I took over, they sent a letter to the Prime Minister saying, please, all decisions of a technical nature should be made by the chief statistician, not by the minister. But there was no response from the Prime Minister, so the issue is still alive. I have gone one step further and I've said, you know, that proposal from the 4 eminent Canadians is a good one, let's do that, but there's a further issue. In effect, the issue which started this whole debate, and the issue is who decides as to what questions are going to get asked in a census. Because census is a constitutional responsibility, but what questions get asked are decided by Cabinet, not by Statistics Canada. So you can see that Cabinet can fulfill this constitutional responsibility by simply saying in a census, what is your name, right? That's it. And everything else is going to be voluntary. I don't think that's the right thing to do. So I have suggested that we should follow the Australian model where the chief statistician decides what questions are going to be asked in the census. So here is the issue. How do you make Statistics Canada an independent organization? The issue has not been taken seriously by anybody. As I said, after the debate started, it really wasn't on anybody's agenda, and after a year, nobody's talking about it except me, taking these kinds of opportunities to say, God, we have a big issue on our hands. Can we do something about it? Anyway, so that is the second issue. The third issue was my resignation. Now, when you become a deputy minister in the government of Canada, and the chief statistician is a deputy minister, and the deputy minister is a civil service job. It's not a politician's job, and so we are, as far removed from politics as anybody can be. And the reason we are called deputy ministers is because we are deputy to a minister. So when we are given that job, and I'm no exception, we are told, look, you're going to be paid once, but you have 2 jobs to do. And the 2 jobs are, one, you must provide fearless advice to whoever the minister is and whoever the prime minister is. Make sure your advice is independent, fearless, and the best that you can think of, regardless of the political colors of the government. Second, your job as well is that once the government has made a decision, as long as it is a lawful decision, it is your duty and obligation to implement that decision to the best of your ability. It doesn't matter that the government has rejected your advice. It doesn't matter how strongly you object to what the government has decided. As long as it is a lawful decision, you must implement that decision loyally. So, when the government made the decision to cancel the long-form census and introduce a voluntary survey, I, as a statistician, obviously wasn't happy about that. But I also knew that it was my job to fully implement the decision that was made by the government. So we were in the process of implementing that decision. The trouble arose when, as I mentioned earlier, there were all these organizations coming out and criticizing the government for that decision. There were provincial governments which were totally unhappy with the decision that was made. What was the government's response to this criticism, which was showing up as headlines in our media, including the largest national daily newspaper, the Globe and Mail, which somehow caught on to this issue and was writing stories day after day on this. It was reported in the media, and that's the way I'm going to describe it, because I don't know what the minister responsible for Statistics Canada actually said, but it was reported in the media not once, not twice, but 3 times, and every time the ante was upped, that it was actually Statistics Canada which had recommended that we replace the census with a survey, and that the chief statistician was fully behind the decision. The other difficulty that arose is that it is against our law to discuss in public the advice that a deputy minister gives to the minister. I just cannot talk about it. So what is my option here, where I find that the reputation of the agency that I had is being debated in the public? I was getting emails and phone calls from people who know about statistics to say, what on earth are you advising the government on? What is this? No statistician would ever suggest that a survey is as good, a voluntary survey is as good as the census. So how can you be providing such advice to the government? And we just could not respond to this. I tried to solve the problem internally by getting the government to own up to the decision that they had made. I did not succeed. And so the only recourse I had was to resign from my job with a public statement. Again, I could not talk about the advice we gave to the government. So the way I decided to handle the issue was to write in my resignation statement, here is a technical statistical issue. It is a technical statistical issue. Can a voluntary survey be as good as a mandatory census? What would a book of statistics say? And the answer is, it cannot. That was my way of saying, would continue to provide the best possible advice to the government. But having said that, I could not continue in my job, and so I sent my resignation. So when I went to the office that Wednesday morning, July 21st, I went like any other day, but when I came home that day, I was without a job, and so that was the end of my professional career in the Canadian Public Service. To me, the resignation of a deputy minister is a big thing. I've been told it has never happened before in this country. I hope it never happens again in this country. It is not something that is a desirable thing, but I thought I had to do that to protect the integrity and reputation of the institution that I headed. That's all I want to say to you, and I would be pleased to answer the question.
Thank you so much for this very interesting presentation. My name is Thomas. I work in Tanzania for the World Bank, but I used to work for Statistics Denmark. So official statistics is very close to my heart, and I thought your presentation was very interesting. I have two questions. One on the census. Maybe you know that Denmark, among a couple of other Scandinavian countries, don't do censuses anymore. We haven't done them for 30, 40 years because our administrative databases are so complete that we don't really need the census. So in light of that incident you described, and sort of a movement in the direction of reducing the burden on respondents, how do you see the future of the census in Canada? I mean, will you one day perhaps move to a situation where you will rely on population registers, civil registration systems instead of the census? That's one thing. The other thing is on the independence. Has there been any fallout from this? I mean, besides these letters to the Prime Minister, is there now some sort of movement to increase the independence of Statistics Canada, perhaps by changing the law and getting an independent board or something like that, that could protect, the independence of the agency?
Well, let me take on the second question first, because the answer to that is short, and the answer is no. The issue hasn't caught on, and I find it a little bit frustrating, but no, there's really not much happening on that front. On the first question of going the European way, Denmark is one example. There are other countries which are doing the same thing. Our privacy laws would not allow that. Data linkage in this country is a big issue. Now, think about the irony. The irony is that the reason why the long-form census was cancelled was because of privacy reasons. That Canadians have a right to their privacy, and so if they don't want to provide the information, that's okay. Going the administrative route that Denmark and other European countries have is a much bigger privacy issue. Like if I give my information to one department of the Government of Canada, that information can be used by others. That is not acceptable in Canada. So, Statistics Canada has been asked to study this option, but that's why I said it's ironic that you're trying to deal with a small privacy issue with a big privacy issue. I just don't see how it works. I would argue that given our privacy laws, the way we do our census is probably the best option. And in fact, if I can take this opportunity to say that the three countries which do their census in the way we do, then us, the US, and Australia. And if you look at the cost of data collection in these three countries, the per household cost of census in Canada is $43. Australia, $49. And the US is $126. And the quality of our data, I don't think anybody would argue that our data is any worse than anybody else's. So we, in fact, have always been looked at as a role model for other countries to follow. So my hope is that come 2016, we'll get back to where we were in 2006.
Good evening, my name is Daniela. I'm from Slovakia, but currently I'm working for UNDP in Thailand. Thank you very much for a very inspirational presentation, I believe, for all of us who are with the public service in all the countries of the world. Thank you very much for that. I would like to lead on your last comment, which was, and also what you said at the beginning, that Canada might be one of the countries where the census was the most debated topic in the media. If it is a consolation for you, Slovakia was recently another country where the census was for 3 weeks, the headlines in all the national medias. European Union, several countries just conducted the census after, I think, 11 years. And the issue that arose there was exactly on the confidentiality of the personal data and to what extent the data that is being provided in this current census is anonymous. And the issue there was that each person of a household was assigned a code by a computer. And the questions arose, whether this is secure enough, whether there is not any leakage, whether there is not a possibility of retroactively to identify the code with the name of the person. So, and the consequences might be that there might be some cases raised in the Constitutional Court. So, this is really a serious issue. So I was wondering how this has been addressed in the Canadian censuses, perhaps in this one, but also in the past.
It's actually instructive to look at the Canadian experience on privacy and confidentiality issues. On privacy, as some of you may know, we have a privacy commissioner who makes it an issue to make sure that privacy is protected. She was actually in the news in the last couple of days. She went after a big Canadian business and said, gee, you're not doing a good job, at protecting the private information of your customers. And she has every intention of going after big business to make sure that privacy is protected. And she, of course, worries about the protection of privacy within the Government of Canada. Statistics Canada has had a principle, which is we will not do anything which the Privacy Commissioner objects to. So in the history of Statistics Canada, there's not a single instance where the Privacy Commissioner has said, we are unhappy with what StatCan does, because for us, privacy is paramount. On the census itself, in the last 2 censuses going back to 2001, and keep in mind there are 33 million Canadians, the Privacy Commissioner over that 10-year period has received 3 complaints on privacy grounds and dismissed all of those. So that's our experience on privacy. Confidentiality, which is a different issue, privacy is just making sure that my information is in the hands of a government organization. The fact that I've given that information, that's a privacy issue. The confidentiality issue is that once I've given that information to a government department, that information has leaked out. In the history of Statistics Canada, there is not a single instance where confidential data has gone out. After I became chief statistician, I heard in spades from our users who actually use the data. many times the complaint that Statistics Canada is paranoid about privacy and confidentiality issues. That was the criticism, not that we are lax. And in fact, actually, I, to some extent, do agree with that, criticism of Statistics Canada, that there are situations where, researchers do need our information, and, we can just make it so hard for them to get it that we don't take any chance, on confidentiality, but at the same time, we may not be able to put out information that is critically important. So I have argued that both objectives, providing information to Canadians who have given it to us and confidentiality are equally important. We cannot sacrifice one at the expense of the other. And I'm happy to report that the organization is making progress on that front. And in effect, as we talk about these things now, Statistics Canada is working with researchers to make business sector data, microdata, available in a manner that will still be totally secure. So no, in Canada, we don't have that issue at all.
Thank you very much for the nice presentation. I'm Robert Banamwana from Rwanda. I'm interested in statistics as well. I have two questions. One is, why is it now that this confidentiality, these laws and these concerns have always been there before, I suppose? Why, in your point of view, what is that triggered this decision? Because I am sure that people in the government, they know probably the implications of this. This is one. Two, what, in your view, might be the consequence in census in developing countries? In some countries, the census is almost totally supported by foreign support, foreign budget support. If people started questioning, they say Canada was the best. Now they are using another way. So, what is your view on those two things? Thank you very much.
On the first question, why did the government do it? I don't have a clue. Nobody has a clue. I was not able to get, an explanation as to why the government made the decision beyond what everybody now knows in public, and that is, the Minister of Industry's statement at the parliamentary committee which examined this issue. I mean, he was asked to come and explain himself, and I was asked to go to the parliamentary committee and answer their questions. His said at that parliamentary committee, he said, in the government's view, we need to have a balance between the needs of the government to collect data and the rights of the citizens to protect their private information. I'm not using his words, but this is what he said. It's the balance between the two things. My, response publicly has been, why do you want to get a balance when you were achieving both the objectives fully before? And the way we were achieving the objectives were the privacy commissioner saying, we are totally satisfied with what Statistics Canada is doing on the privacy front. Having gotten the privacy commissioner's blessing for what we were doing, we would go out and collect the very best data at least cost. So we were achieving both the objectives, and the government's view was, no, we want to achieve a balance. That's what they have said. Don't ask me, whether I understand it or not. I mean, that on the second question of the implications of this for the rest of the world, it really is unfortunate that, Canada would do this. Being the best in the world, for us to do this is setting a bad precedent. And the only thing I can say is to the rest of the world, while we in Canada may be doing a lot of wonderful things, this is not a thing you should follow. This is my advice to everybody. Census is really important. Other data are really important, and that's where I started. It is my view that all decisions that are based on evidence are better than those decisions made on ideology and philosophy. That's the point I'm really trying to make. And in this particular case, that's not what Canada has done. And so please don't follow us in this one example. There are other wonderful things we do that you should follow, but not this one.
I think in the interest of time, we'll have, it looks like 3 more questions. Yeah? Okay.
Munir Sahab, Assalamu alaikum. I'm Jasimuddin from Bangladesh, but working from the Commonwealth Secretariat in London. I don't have a particular question, but a curiosity, and that is in relation to human rights. How did you handle that in terms of your mandatory and the obligatory part with regard to the return of the census and the survey form? Thank you.
I haven't really given it that kind of thought from that perspective. I really am not very knowledgeable about human rights issues. I wish I did, but I don't. The way census fits into our system is, as I said, it's part of our constitution. And the constitution says there must be a census in this country. And of course there is a census in this country. We have the short form census with 8 questions. And that to me is the weakness in our system, which I'm hoping that we will fix someday in the law that governs Statistics Canada, which is, in my view, the questions for the census will be decided by the chief statistician. There's a precedent for it. Australia does it. Why shouldn't we? And I think that would be a truly effective way to meet our constitutional obligation, because otherwise, you can meet that obligation, as I said, with asking a question, tell me what your name is, and you're done. So that's the only perspective that I can provide the answer on. I don't have the answer to your question in a direct manner.
Doctor, I would like to congratulate you for a very wonderful experience in your public life that you came here this evening to share with us. My question borders on your last key point, which dwells on your resignation. It's a delicate issue which must be handled delicately. And any lesson learned, especially for people like us who are also in the public service, is a great deal for us. What comes to my mind is that in the course of preparation for the decision of the government to conduct the census, I'm wondering if you have ever documented your own advice on the approach that the census should be conducted to the government. And if that has been done, and the government upon which you are mandated by law to serve loyally did not honor, the situation now becomes much more complicated. It appears as if your hands are tied. You have been placed in a very deep well. You are crying to be raised out, looking up to the government that employed you, but no help. Instead, the well is even getting a cover. And you cry until you finally give up. So my question is it that you didn't document your advice, which could be a lacuna on your own side? Or is it that you have done, but the government didn't honor? I would like to share that experience from you. Thank you.
Well, the advice that a public servant gives to the government or a deputy minister, communicating to a minister representing the department, generally is documented. And so our advice to the government on this issue is documented, but that advice is protected under the law from public knowledge. That is the law of the land, and there's a good reason for that law. The reason for the protection of this information is that in our system of government, the elected government of the day has the authority and right to make whatever decisions should be made. So when the government goes out in public and says, this is what we're going to do, it is that government's decision, even if the advice came from the public service. It is the government's decision to do whatever they want to do. If that advice became public, you can see that the system will completely break down, because in situations where the government makes a decision contrary to the advice of the public servants, the information about that would be known to everybody, and it will create a nightmare where the government has to defend itself every time that happens as to why did it not follow the advice that was given to them. I don't think that debate should ever take place. Why? Because the government has been given the authority by Canadians to make that decision, and regardless of the advice they get from the public servants, they should be making that decision. And sometimes the consequences of that are not pleasant, as you see in this particular case, but this is the kind of price that we should be prepared to pay, like the reduction in the quality of our data. It is the price we pay to make the system work in total, because the alternative is worse. And so I made it a point to clarify to everybody that I must continue to do my job regardless of what the decision of the government is. It is only when I was held responsible for a decision I did not make, and that began to affect the reputation of the organization that I was heading, that I did not find there was any other option for me but to do this. And what I'm hoping for is, as I said earlier, I hope that never happens again, where the government would and always should make the decisions on policy issues regardless of the advice they get from the public service, and that information shouldn't ever get discussed, so the public knows that it is the government which makes the decision, regardless of what they're told by the public servants, because they are the ones who must make those decisions. And so it hopefully was a unique situation I got into that would not happen again. But I think the way our system works, it is really quite good. It's unfortunate that I was put in that situation, but that's the way life is.
Thank you. My name's Zoe. I'm from the UK's Department for International Development. So I really appreciated your talk and your integrity. So my questions are, firstly, around whether we need to put more effort into building support for a census and why it's valuable. You mentioned that there were some Aboriginal groups who actually were reluctant, didn't want to have questions asked of them. And certainly in the UK, we have quite a significant group that is opposed to government knowing information about them. And so I wonder if we need to be doing more to explain to people why it's valuable for the country at large, for them, to have this information. And my second question was just, has there not been any politicians who've also been concerned, vocal, opposed in some way to this government decision?
There are two different, issues here. One is an ongoing challenge of getting the Aboriginal population to provide information. And that is a political issue in Canada because the view of a number of Aboriginal groups is that they're sovereign nation. And so being sovereign nations, Canada has no right to collect their information. According to the law that governs Statistics Canada and according to the Constitution, Statistics Canada has every right to go and force people to provide the information, because if they don't, you can take them to court and apply the law. But I'm sure you'll appreciate that given the sensitivity of the issue, that is really not a practical solution to the problem, but it's a huge political issue. Leaving that aside, something which is not a simple thing to handle, for the rest of the country, there wasn't much of an issue that people will not be willing to provide the information. And in fact, our experience has been that close to 99% of the population willingly provides information. If you tell them this is the law of the land, they'll give you the information. There have been occasionally, a small number of individuals who, say that, for a variety of reasons, we won't give the information. But that number is really small. Like I said, over 10 years, people who have complained about this on privacy issues, on grounds, there are 3 people who did that. But there's a bigger number of people who have objected to providing the information, not on privacy grounds, but on other grounds. Like, for example, in the 2006 census, if I remember my number correctly, there were 14 people who were charged for not completing the census information. And they had one issue, and the issue was that in 2006, Statistics Canada gave a contract for a small amount of money to this firm in the US, which is both a developer of software and has defense contracts, of course, with the US Department of Defense. And these 14 people objected that because StatCan has given this contract to an American firm which does business with the US Department of Defense, that on moral grounds they will not provide the information. The other concern in the same context was that because this firm has developed some software for Statistics Canada, that they have access to our data, which of course is farthest from truth, because the only people who have access to our data is a small number of people within StatCan, and nobody else has any access to our data. So that's an issue, but given the number of people who I'm talking about really is not an issue, but the Aboriginal issue is a big one.
I think we just heard a honest, frank discussion of some issues that in some way, in some form, often in our careers as evaluators, we end up having to deal with. The issues of safeguarding privacy, respecting confidentiality, and living with what commitments we make, and understanding the role of the individual, often public servant, and the role of a national government. These are serious issues, and we are grateful for the presentation and the thought and thinking that we've heard tonight. We thank you for sharing much about this process and what you have been able to tell us about the decision-making that went into it and your thoughts that went into it. So we thank you for this presentation. We have a little token of our appreciation to give you. This is, as our participants well know, it's a lovely little paperweight of the cover of IPDET, and we thank you so much for coming again.
Thank you.
This concludes our evening, but many of these issues will be picked up tomorrow morning in our discussion of ethics. So we'll look forward to picking that up. Thank you, and see you in the morning of Day 9 of IPDET 2011. Good evening.